In the last decade of his life, Albert Einstein was working on something that most of his colleagues considered a dead end. A unified field theory, a single mathematical framework that would describe all the forces of nature, gravity, electromagnetism, and the quantum forces, as expressions of one underlying reality. He worked on it obsessively through the 1940s and into the early 1950s, while the rest of physics moved in different directions. While younger physicists built careers on quantum mechanics and particle physics, Einstein kept returning to the same question. Is there a single field that underlies everything? He died in 1955 without finding the answer, or at least without finding it in the language of mathematics. Because the answer to Einstein's question, the answer to the question of whether there is a single unified field underlying all of physical reality, had already been given, thousands of years before Einstein was born, in a language that was not mathematics, but that was, in its own domain, every bit as precise. The language of the Vedic tradition of ancient India. The Vedic seers, the rishis who composed the Upanishads, who developed the philosophical systems of Vedanta, who investigated the nature of reality through the most rigorous first-person inquiry ever conducted, described the underlying unity of all existence with a clarity and precision that Einstein spent his final years trying to approach from the outside. They called it Brahman, the infinite, self-aware, undivided field of consciousness that is the ground of all phenomena, the one reality from which all the apparent multiplicity of the universe, all matter, all energy, all force, all form, arises and into which it ultimately returns. Einstein was looking for a unified field. The Vedic tradition had described one, thousands of years earlier. And tonight, we are going to follow Einstein's unfinished journey into the territory that the ancient seers had already mapped, not as a coincidence, as a convergence that tells us something fundamental about the nature of reality. To understand what Einstein was reaching toward in his final years, we need to understand what he had already accomplished and why it was not enough. In 1905, a 26-year-old patent clerk in Bern, Switzerland, published 4 papers that would change the course of physics forever. The special theory of relativity, the photoelectric effect, the theory of Brownian motion, and the equation that would become the most famous in human history, E equals mc squared. These papers established 2 things that are directly relevant to our conversation tonight. First, they established that matter and energy are not 2 different things. They are 2 expressions of the same thing. The equation E equals mc squared does not merely say that matter can be converted to energy. It says that matter is energy, organized, condensed, structured into the forms we call physical objects. The apparent solidity of the physical world is, at a more fundamental level, pure energy, pure movement, pure process. The ancient Vedic tradition had a word for this underlying energetic ground of physical reality. They called it Shakti, the primordial creative energy that manifests as all physical phenomena. Every object, every force, every movement in the universe was understood as an expression of Shakti, not as something separate from the divine ground of reality, but as the divine ground of reality expressing itself in dynamic physical form. Einstein's equation, 2,500 years after the Upanishads, arrived at the same conclusion from the outside. Matter is not solid substance. It is energy, it is process. It is something more like a wave than a particle, more like a verb than a noun. The second thing that Einstein established was equally significant. The special theory of relativity demonstrated that space and time are not absolute, fixed frameworks within which events occur. They are relative, dependent on the position and velocity of the observer. What appears as simultaneous to one observer does not appear as simultaneous to another. What appears as a certain distance to one observer appears as a different distance to another. Space and time, the most fundamental categories through which ordinary human experience organizes reality, are not features of reality itself. They are features of a particular perspective on reality. The Vedic tradition called this Maya, the principle by which the infinite appears as the finite, by which the one appears as many, by which the timeless appears as temporal. Space and time, in the Vedic understanding, are not ultimate features of reality, but aspects of the way in which ordinary consciousness organizes its experience of a reality that is, at its deepest level, beyond space and time. Einstein had arrived, through mathematics, at the same conclusion the Vedic seers had arrived at through inner inquiry. The categories of ordinary experience are not ultimate. Reality is more unified, more fluid, more fundamentally connected than ordinary perception suggests. But Einstein was not finished. He had shown that space and time were relative. He had shown that matter and energy were equivalent. And then he spent the next 40 years trying to show something more. That all of it, all the forces, all the fields, all the apparent diversity of physical phenomena, was an expression of a single underlying reality. The unified field theory that Einstein pursued for the last 3 decades of his life was not simply a technical problem in physics. It was, at its deepest level, a metaphysical conviction. Einstein believed, with a certainty that went beyond what his mathematics had yet been able to prove, that the universe was fundamentally one, that beneath the apparent multiplicity of forces and particles and fields, there was a single reality, simple, unified, complete. He expressed this conviction in language that surprised many of his colleagues. Language that was not the language of physics, but the language of something closer to philosophy, or even to what we might cautiously call spirituality. He spoke of a cosmic religious feeling, a sense of the deep unity and harmony of nature that was, he said, the source of all genuine science. Not the desire to manipulate or control nature, but a kind of reverence for its underlying order. He said that the most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious, and that whoever cannot feel wonder, whoever cannot stand wrapped in awe, is as good as dead, a snuffed candle. He said that he wanted to know God's thoughts, and that everything else was details. These statements have often been dismissed as poetic metaphor. The scientist, reaching for language adequate to describe his intuitions when the mathematics had not yet caught up. But when you read them alongside the texts of the Vedic tradition, alongside the Upanishads, alongside the philosophical system of Advaita Vedanta developed by Adi Shankaracharya, something extraordinary happens. The language becomes almost interchangeable. The Mundaka Upanishad, one of the most important of the Upanishadic texts, states, Brahman is that from which all beings are born, by which all beings live, and into which all beings return at death. Seek to know that is Brahman. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad states, "This whole world is Brahman. Everything comes from Brahman. Everything returns to Brahman. Everything breathes with Brahman." Einstein was seeking, in mathematical language, what these texts describe in the language of direct inner experience. A single reality that underlies and pervades all phenomena. A ground of being from which everything arises and to which everything returns. A unified field. The Vedic tradition called it Brahman. Einstein called it the unified field. And here is the most striking part of this story. In the last years of his life, Einstein began to read the texts of the Vedic tradition directly. He was familiar with the work of Swami Vivekananda, the Indian philosopher and monk who had introduced Vedantic philosophy to the Western world at the end of the 19th century. And he was aware that what Vivekananda was describing, the non-dual nature of reality, the underlying unity of consciousness and matter, the single ground from which all phenomena arise, resonated deeply with his own intuitions about the nature of the physical world. There is a story reported by several sources close to Einstein that after reading the Vedantic texts, Einstein said that if he had encountered this philosophy earlier in his life, he would not have needed to develop the theory of relativity, because the Vedic tradition had already described what relativity was pointing toward. But Einstein is not the only physicist whose work has brought modern science into striking convergence with the ancient Vedic understanding. The history of 20th century physics is, in many ways, the history of physicists discovering, to their considerable surprise and frequent discomfort, that reality at the most fundamental level looks nothing like the common sense Newtonian picture of a world of solid objects moving through empty space. And it looks remarkably like what the Vedic tradition has been saying for thousands of years. We have spoken in previous conversations about the double slit experiment and what it reveals about the role of the observer in quantum mechanics. Tonight, let us look at three more discoveries from 20th century physics that converge with striking precision on the Vedic understanding of the nature of reality. The first is the discovery of quantum entanglement. In 1935, Einstein, together with Boris Podolsky and Nathan Rosen, published a paper that was intended to demonstrate a problem with quantum mechanics. The paper described a situation in which two particles, after interacting, become correlated in such a way that measuring one particle instantly affects the other, regardless of the distance between them. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance and considered it evidence that quantum mechanics was incomplete. He believed that there must be a more fundamental level of reality, hidden variables he called them, that would restore the kind of local independent behavior that common sense requires. He was wrong. Subsequent experiments, culminating in the work of physicist John Bell in the 1960s, and a series of increasingly rigorous experimental tests over the following decades, demonstrated definitively that quantum entanglement is real, that particles that have interacted remain correlated across arbitrary distances, with no signal passing between them. The universe, at the quantum level, is non-local. Things that appear to be separate are connected in ways that transcend the ordinary categories of space and time. The Vedic tradition had a term for this. They called it the non-dual nature of reality, advaita, the understanding that the apparent separateness of things is a feature of the way in which ordinary consciousness organizes its experience, not a feature of reality at its most fundamental level. At the level of Brahman, the infinite ground of all existence, there is no separation. What appears as separate objects interacting through space and time is, at a deeper level, a single, undivided, internally coherent reality expressing itself in the form of multiplicity. Quantum entanglement, confirmed in laboratory after laboratory, across half a century of increasingly sophisticated experimentation, is the physical sciences' discovery of what the Vedic tradition had been saying for 3,000 years. The world is not made of separate things. It is made of relationships, of correlations, of patterns of connection that cannot be fully described within the framework of local, independent, separately existing objects. It is made in the language of physics, of fields, in the language of the Vedanta of Brahman. The second discovery from 20th century physics that converges with the Vedic understanding is what physicists call the quantum vacuum. In the conventional picture of reality, empty space is empty. It is the absence of matter and energy, the nothing that separates things from each other. Quantum field theory, the most successful and most precisely tested theory in the history of physics, describes empty space very differently. The quantum vacuum is not empty. It is a seething, dynamic field of virtual particles, particle-antiparticle pairs that constantly arise and dissolve, too brief to be directly observed, but real enough to produce measurable physical effects. The energy density of the quantum vacuum is, according to the equations of quantum field theory, almost incomprehensibly large. Some calculations suggest that a cubic centimetre of empty space contains more energy than all the matter in the observable universe. The apparently empty space between things is not empty at all. It is the most energetically dense reality in the universe. And from this field, from what appears to ordinary perception as nothing, all physical phenomena arise. The particles that make up atoms arise as excitations of quantum fields. The forces that hold matter together are, at the most fundamental level, the exchange of virtual particles arising from the quantum vacuum. The entire physical world, every galaxy, every star, every atom in your body, is, in the language of quantum field theory, a pattern of excitation in the underlying quantum vacuum. The Vedic tradition describes the relationship between Brahman and the physical world in terms that are strikingly parallel. Brahman is not a being that exists somewhere in or beyond the universe. Brahman is the ground of being itself, the infinite self-aware field from which all phenomena arise as temporary patterns, like waves arising from and returning to the ocean. The ocean does not go anywhere when the wave arises. The wave does not become something separate from the ocean. The wave is the ocean, expressing itself in that particular form, for that particular duration. And the quantum vacuum, the infinite, dynamic, energetically dense ground from which all physical phenomena arise, is what the Vedic tradition calls Brahman, encountered from the outside through the instruments of physics rather than from the inside through the instruments of contemplative inquiry. Einstein spent his final years looking for a unified field. He did not know, or perhaps he was beginning to suspect, that the unified field he was looking for was not only a mathematical structure waiting to be discovered. It was the ground of his own awareness. The same awareness that the Vedic seers investigated directly from the inside and described with extraordinary precision in the texts that Einstein was reading in the last decade of his life. Now, we need to sit with the most important question that this convergence raises. Why does it matter? Not philosophically, not as an intellectual curiosity about the parallel between ancient wisdom and modern science. Why does it matter for you, for your actual life, your actual experience, the actual quality of the days you are living? The answer begins with what the convergence reveals about the nature of the reality you inhabit. If Einstein's physics and the Vedic tradition are both pointing toward the same underlying unity, if the apparent separateness of things is a feature of ordinary perception rather than a feature of reality at its most fundamental level, then the sense of isolation that is the most characteristic feature of ordinary human experience is based on a misperception, not a moral failing, not a psychological weakness, not something to be ashamed of or struggled against, a misperception. The ordinary human sense of being a separate self, a bounded, isolated entity, moving through a world of other separate entities, permanently at risk of loss and damage, and ultimately of death, is not the final truth about the nature of your situation. It is what the Vedic tradition calls avidya, ignorance. Not ignorance in the pejorative sense, but in the precise technical sense of not knowing. The failure to recognize what is actually the case at the most fundamental level of reality. And here is what the Vedic tradition says about what happens when avidya is dissolved, when the recognition of the underlying unity replaces the habitual sense of separation. The suffering that is rooted in separation dissolves with it. Not the ordinary pains and difficulties of human life. Those continue. The body ages, relationships change, loss happens. But the particular quality of suffering that comes from believing oneself to be fundamentally isolated, from the chronic low-level anxiety of the separate self that is always defending its boundaries, always managing its vulnerability, always aware of the fragility of everything it depends on. That specific quality of suffering dissolves when the recognition of unity replaces the illusion of separation, because it was never based on anything real. It was based on avidya, on not knowing. Einstein was approaching this recognition from the outside, through the equations of physics, through the mathematical description of a unified field that underlies all apparent diversity. The Vedic seers approached it from the inside, through the direct investigation of the nature of awareness, through the recognition of what the witness of all experience actually is. But they were approaching the same recognition from different directions. And the recognition itself, when it occurs, in whatever form it occurs, is not the acquisition of new information. It is the dissolution of a fundamental misunderstanding, the misunderstanding that you are separate. If you have followed this conversation all the way to this point, through Einstein's lifelong search for a unified field, through the quantum discoveries of entanglement and the vacuum, through the Vedic description of Brahman as the ground of all existence, through the convergence of physics and ancient wisdom on the single point of the underlying unity of reality, then something has happened that deserves to be acknowledged. You have been in contact with the most important idea in the history of human thought. Not the most complicated, not the most technically sophisticated. The most important, because it is the idea that changes everything, not abstractly, not philosophically, not in some distant future, after sufficient spiritual practice, in the actual texture of your actual experience. Now, because here is what the Vedic tradition and what the physics is beginning to confirm is actually saying about you personally. The awareness that is reading these words right now is not a small, isolated, bounded thing inside a body, inside a universe. It is the universe knowing itself. The same field that Einstein was looking for, the unified ground of all physical phenomena, is the same field as the awareness that is present right now as you read these words. Not as a metaphor, not as a poetic way of saying that we are all connected, as the most precise statement available about the actual relationship between consciousness and the physical world. The Vedic term for this recognition, the moment when awareness recognizes its own nature as identical with the ground of all existence, is moksha, liberation. Not liberation from the world, not escape from physical existence, liberation from the fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of that existence. The misunderstanding that you are separate, that you are small, that you are fundamentally at risk. Einstein spent the last 30 years of his life looking for the unified field in equations. The Vedic tradition says it is what you are, and the extraordinary convergence between what Einstein's physics discovered and what the ancient seers described suggests that both paths, the outer path of mathematical physics and the inner path of contemplative inquiry, are approaching the same reality from different directions. And that reality, when it is finally recognized, whether through the equations of a physicist or the stillness of a genuine meditation, is not a distant, abstract, theoretical thing. It is the most immediate, most present, most undeniably real fact of your existence. At Sacred Flame, we exist to help people approach this recognition, not as a belief, not as a doctrine, but as a direct investigation into the nature of what they actually are. Subscribe if this work matters to you. Share this with someone who has always sensed that the picture of reality they were given, the picture of separate things in empty space, of isolated selves in an indifferent universe, was not the whole story. They were right. And the evidence from the most advanced physics on Earth and from the oldest contemplative traditions still living is now available for anyone willing to look at it honestly. We began tonight with Einstein in the last decade of his life, working on a problem that most of his colleagues had given up on: the unified field theory, the search for a single mathematical framework that would show all the forces of nature as expressions of one underlying reality. He never found it, not in the language of mathematics, not in a form that could be written as equations and published in a physics journal and verified in a laboratory. But the search itself, the conviction that drove it, the intuition of unity that Einstein carried through decades of work, points towards something that is not a failure. It points toward the recognition that the unified field he was looking for cannot be fully described from the outside, cannot be captured in equations alone. Because the unified field, the single reality underlying all apparent diversity, includes the observer, includes the awareness that is doing the investigating, includes the consciousness through which all physical phenomena are ultimately known. And consciousness cannot fully describe itself from the outside, any more than an eye can see itself seeing. This is why the Vedic tradition, which arrived at the same recognition thousands of years before Einstein, developed not mathematical methods, but contemplative ones. Not the investigation of the external world through instruments and equations, but the investigation of the nature of awareness itself, from the inside, through the direct turning of attention back toward its own source. And what the Vedic seers found at the end of that investigation is what Einstein was approaching at the end of his, that the ground of all physical phenomena and the ground of consciousness are not two different things. That matter and awareness, the objective and the subjective, are two aspects of a single reality that is prior to both. That Brahman, the infinite, self-aware, undivided field, is both the ground of the physical universe and the deepest nature of the human being who is trying to understand it. Einstein, in his final years, was reading the Vedic texts. He was encountering, in the language of an ancient tradition, the recognition that his physics was approaching but could not quite reach. The unified field is not something to be discovered by physics. It is something to be recognized by awareness. Recognized as what awareness actually is. This is the recognition that the Vedic tradition has been offering for 3,000 years. This is the recognition that every great contemplative tradition we have explored on this channel, the Egyptian mystery schools, the Gnostic Christians, the Sufi mystics, the Kabbalists, the Tibetan masters, has been pointing toward from different directions. The universe is not made of separate things. You are not separate from it. And the awareness reading these words, the simple, clear, unadorned fact of being present right now, is not inside the universe. The universe is inside it. Einstein spent his last years trying to prove this. The Vedic sages already knew it. And now you have been shown both paths to the same recognition. What you do with that is the only question that remains. Until next time, stay awake.